So usually we say there are two major components of social class. The first is occupational prestige. Your occupation is often linked to your income, but it's also linked to things like leisure time, aesthetic preferences, political orientation. It often influences which groups have the greatest buying power and the greatest market potential. And so oftentimes we look at a person's occupation to tell us a lot about them as a consumer. The other component of social class is often income, but it might not always be the best component when it comes to social class, right? So we could have a garbage collector who makes 100K, which is absolutely true. Again, going back to this idea that some people in trade schools make very good money, some people who are trashmen make very good money, right? But I'm not sure that we would say someone who makes $100,000 who's a garbage person is necessarily in a high social class. They might be in a high income, not necessarily a high social class. And so what we usually say is how money is spent versus how much we spend tends to be more important to marketers. We don't really look at income because income becomes so tricky now, right? It was one thing when we looked at income and said only the rich take vacations. That's not true anymore. The poor take vacations, right? um, because vacations have become more accessible to lower income consumers, right? You can go on a vacation on a cruise for $1,000. You can save up for the cruise for 2 years or so and still go. So it's not something that's only um, given or allowed or accessible for the rich. Vacations, not anymore. It used to be that certain items, only rich people had iPhones. Only rich people drove cars. Only rich people drove fancy cars. These things aren't true, and if they're not true, then you can't just look at income in and of itself as a component of social class. So social class does indeed change over time. So there are a few things that we talk about when we talk about um, social class changing. First is this idea of upward mobility. For a lot of consumers, the number one way to become upwardly mobile is education, right? So for a lot of consumers, education does open up the door to becoming upwardly mobile, to moving up in terms of social class. In terms of downward mobility, a lot of that is tied to job loss. So oftentimes when people lose their job, not only are they losing their income, but they start to engage in what we call status panic, right? In the sense that they begin to panic about their status, regardless of where it is in the kind of social class spectrum. Another thing that we have to talk about is this idea of fragmentation. Again, there are blurred class distinctions and divisions. So again, it used to be that only rich people would do certain things. I just read an article not too long ago about a guy who was stopped at the Gucci store and he was trying to buy a Gucci belt. What got me about the article, and I'm not telling people where to spend their money, but this guy was a college student and he decided to go out and treat himself to a Gucci belt. And I thought to myself, wow, how does a college student afford a Gucci belt? So now when we see people who are wearing things like Gucci belts, we can't necessarily assume that the Gucci belt on their body or their belt buckle necessarily means that they have lots of money, because it very well could not mean that at all. That's a distinct possibility. Because we have more accessibility to mass media, we have more knowledge than ever before, but we also have more knowledge about things like cheap vacations if we want to take one. And then because of advances in communication technology, we know more about the world, we see more of the world, we just have more accessibility, and that's something that drives down the distinctions in social class. So I always think that these kind of slides are really, really interesting. So when we think about social class, we have to think about things like economic mobility, right? As part of the American dream, we often think that the American dream it can be summed up by saying that you will be more economically mobile and richer than your parents, right? So what does that look like for people of today? When we ask people, according to, I believe this is from Pew, Is this from Pew? No, this is from PRRI, or the Brookings Institute. So when you ask people to finish the sentence, my generation is worse off than my parents were. Um, Millennials are significantly more likely, particularly compared to the silent generation, to say that this is true, right? So almost 60% of millennials say that they are worse off than their parents, right? Whereas Generation X, baby boomer, silent generation, it tends to go down. When we ask them to complete this sentence, my generation is better off than my children will be, we see about similar results from everybody. I think there are a lot of different ways to interpret this. I think probably because we have a lot more media that's always telling us how broke we are, regardless of whether or not we are broke, we tend to be a little bit pessimistic. On the other hand, when we ask people if they believe they will reach the American dream, 37% say that they will reach it. 31% say that they have achieved it. Right? That means 68% of Americans either believe that they have reached the American dream or they will reach it. Which makes me wonder personally, how do people define the American dream?
So I want to take a moment and talk about social mobility. So, social mobility is the movement of individuals, families, households, or other categories of people. It could be a group of workers, whoever, within or between a system of social hierarchy or stratification. And let me give you the two primary ways we think about social mobility. So horizontal mobility happens when you have movement from one position to another within the same social level, right? So you could change jobs without necessarily altering your occupational status. So let's say you are a garbage man or woman and you go from the person who actually loads the garbage into the back of the truck, if you're in one of those type of jobs, or and you get a change in jobs and you become the person who drives the truck, right? In that case, you're moving from one position to another and you're within the same social level. On the other hand, let's say I'm an assistant professor at Wayne State. Let's say I next year decide to take a assistant professor position somewhere else, and now I have taken another position, but I'm at the same occupational status. I'm still an assistant professor, right? On the other hand, let's say you work an entry level position at Ford and you leave Ford to work at GM to take another entry level position there, right? And ultimately, let's say you decide to jump ship to GM because GM paid you $15,000 more. Sure, $15,000 is good money. It's definitely good money to leave a company for if you don't like the company or you want to make more money, whatever the reason would be. But it doesn't necessarily put you in a different occupational status. It doesn't put you in a different social status, right? You're still in an entry level position. $15,000 isn't going to be you can't buy a brand new home for the most part for $15,000. So you're not really kind of changing your social status and you're not changing your occupational status with these moves, right? So you can move between social groups, you can move between occupation, and you still maintain the same social status, and that's what's meant by horizontal mobility. Why then do people move between horizontal mobility? Millions of reasons, right? Maybe $15,000 is enough for you to send your kid to private school and that's something you want to do, or buy yourself a new car and that's something you want to do. Maybe you hate your job and you just need to leave. It's something you want to do. Maybe if you're the garbage man or woman, it's because you have bad knees and it's just easier for you to drive than it is to haul garbage. Or maybe it's because you just want to try something different in a different industry. There are a million reasons. On the other hand, let's say you are a middle class person and you come from a very standard middle, not upper middle class, lower, just standard middle class family, and you marry someone and you and your spouse live a middle class life, right? Which is very normative now. It used to be for some people. Their whole goal for getting married might have been to move into a position of a higher status. That can be a bit tricky. there are only so many people that are going to be able to push you into, um, let's say, a upper middle class life or something like that. So a lot of people get married, and they get married to someone and they end up having the same social status that they had with their spouse. Besides which, you know, this is fairly normative. On the other hand, you could have vertical mobility where you move from one social level to a higher one, which we would call upward mobility, or to a lower one, which we would call downward mobility. An example of upward mobility would, maybe getting a promotion and going from entry level to regional director, or going from manager to regional director, right? Typically, such a move comes with a pretty large pay bump, and it usually will come with some kind of different social status. So that would be an example of upward mobility. On the other hand, if you lose a regional position, director position, and your next position is an entry level one, let's say the economy is bad and it's hard to find a job, so on and so forth. That would be an example of downward mobility. Or you could do like me, right? So I was working for Philip Morris, and I chose to leave Philip Morris and become a student, right? So I definitely experienced downward mobility. Why did I do it? It was something I wanted to do. It's like, yeah, this is a dream of mine, and I'm going to pursue my dream. And sometimes when you pursue your dream, you take risk, and you take a lower level status. You just do that. If you happen to read the emails we get from Wayne State, the communications about what's going on at the university and different things like that, or if you've checked the front page of the Wayne State website, you'll notice that Wayne State is very proud that in 2025, rankings came out for U.S. News and World Report, and there were two rankings that Wayne State was very proud of. The first is that Wayne State, for the first time in its history, is considered a top 100 public university, which is a big deal. Again, the first time in its history. The second is that Wayne was ranked number 62 in terms of social mobility. And I think they looked at 1,400 schools for this ranking. I think for both, actually. So of the 1,400 schools, Wayne State was considered, a top performer in terms of social mobility. And the announcement is like, oh, it's a top school for social mobility. I think last year Wayne was ranked number 89. This year, number 62. So quite a big jump. What's really interesting, two things. One is that I'm not sure the announcement that we were given, don't quote me on this part because I don't remember, but I don't think the announcement actually mentions the fact that 8 schools tied for number 62. Of those schools, I list them here in this table: Portland State, which is a great school; University of North Carolina, Charlotte, which is a really great school. My nieces and nephew live in Charlotte. I'm actually trying to convince them to go to Charlotte, to go to UNC Charlotte for undergraduate. The University of Incarnate World, which is in Texas. If you look at the top 50 to 70 schools, top 1 through 70, top 1 through 50, most of those schools are in Florida. They are in Texas. They are in, you do see some schools in North Carolina, but most of them are in Texas and Florida, which makes, oh, I'm sorry, I missed the big one. Most of them are in California, Texas, and Florida, which are huge in terms of population. So NYU, so New York University, Clark Atlanta, Wayne State, California State. I think that's California State. Where is that? One of the California State schools, and then University of Texas, El Paso. So lots of schools that were ranked number 62, but 62 is still great. Definitely still great. What's really interesting, I don't really put a lot of stock into U.S. News and World Report. I think the way they do their rankings is somewhat shady. But they do have a full methodology which you can look into when they rank schools. They rank them from everything from student to faculty ratio to where faculty are publishing. So, I do a lot of research where I'm publishing my research, to faculty staff pay, to, placement rates for students, all of these things. I'm not saying these things are important, but there are certain things that they do measure that I think are a little less important. What's really interesting about social mobility, though, is that for social mobility, they only use two measures. So for the typical ranking, they actually use quite a few measures. But for social mobility, they use two measures, and they're both taken from Pell Grant information. And it's one, Pell Grant graduation rates, and Pell graduation performance. And so, how are these people who have Pell Grants, how are they performing? And so, we were ranked number 62. We have some very illustrious schools who are ranked 62 with us. Some of these are public schools. Portland State is a public school. California State is a public school. Wayne State is a public school. We also have University of Texas as a public, and El Paso is a public school. On the other hand, we have private schools. NYU, private school. University of the Incarnate World, private school. Clark Atlanta, private school. So on and so forth. But it is an honor, and so something to definitely be acknowledged.
I forgot to mention the picture in the last slide. The woman said she was Insta famous, right? So now we're in a position where you actually can be Insta famous, right? So because you can be Insta famous, right? We have like, Instagram models and stuff like this. You don't necessarily need to go through the proper channels, which is awesome because a lot of the proper channels tend to have gatekeepers, right? So the rich tend to be gatekeepers because if everyone can do it, then it's not as great anymore. And so now that we have more democracy in terms of spreading our messages and spreading our looks and our talents, that's good for, I think, a lot of people. Another thing that happens when it comes to social class influence is that social class influences what we wear, right? So there are two kind of things that we talk about a lot when we talk about social class and fashion. The first is this idea of trickle down. Lower classes copy trends of upper classes, right? The other is what we call status float, where there are certain trends that start in lower or middle classes and then spread upward. So we could argue that this example I'm going to use could be an example of either. I don't know. I'm not really a super fashion conscious. So you see this dress, or you see these variations of this dress. So Saint Laurent had this dress appear in their campaign for 2013. A similar looking dress came to Primark, which is a British retailer, and then another company made something similar, Zara, right? So we could say this is essentially trickle down. It first showed up in Saint Laurent, and now it's at Primark, and now it's at Zara. On the other hand, this could be an example of status flow. It could very well be that this dress appeared at Zara and then went up the chain, and now it's at, the fashion show for YSL. I mean, anything is possible, but both of those things are said to occur. I'm sure we can think of fashion where that happens, right? So particularly among fast fashion retailers. So if you go to H&M or places like this, you're likely to see some trickle down, and you may also see some level of status float. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and think about instances of trickle down or status float that you have seen. I can pretty much guarantee you a question about this will be on the test, so it's good to kind of come up with your own example now. So this article came out, and I can't remember where it came from. Maybe Bankgrade.com. I can't remember. Anyway, most people making six figures either have nothing saved in the bank or less than $1,000 stowed away. So I don't know how true or not this is. I'm going to assume it's somewhat credible. If this is true, then it means that people who are making over $100,000, even though they might have a prestigious job, they might make prestigious money, they probably live an upper class lifestyle, meaning they have 3 vacations a year, things like this. That's very pricey. And so maybe the difference now between social classes is just kind of how much money you're saving. I don't know. You tell me. Again, these are the things, the fragmentation and the inability to kind of separate what makes someone higher class versus lower class again becomes mixed because you see things like this. You have no money saved away. What do we know about social class? One, as we understand it as marketers, it's not really that great of a segmentation tactic. We It's better if you use very specific interpretations of class. So maybe you look at social class in terms of how many vacations people take a year, how much money they put away for their savings, how many kids they have versus their income, these kind of things, versus just saying you make X amount of money a year, you are X class. So I thought this was really interesting. Who is middle income and upper income? So for an upper income person who's by themselves, upper income is about 72.5 a year. Middle income is about 24,000. For two people, 34,000 for middle income, over 100 for two. When you get to five people, so a family, 162,000 is considered upper income, 54 is considered middle income. I think this is really interesting because if you really think about it, the difference between 4 and 5 people and 3 and 5 people isn't that great in terms of the difference in income that you might have in middle income. So something to consider.